Welcome everybody to today's webinar. This is the effects of prehistoric planet Ice Age, and I'm going to be your host today for about an hour from now. And let me introduce myself a little bit. So my name is Ed. I am an effects supervisor here with Framestore. Over the past about 13 to 14 years, I've had the privilege to work on a variety of shows, most of which are with Framestore, so the majority of my career basically. And it's been a really good ride. I've had the chance to work on a really wide range of shows, ranging from more of a story-based, kind of character-based films up to TV series, movies in a variety of different genre. And I've had the chance to kind of play around with a lot of different types of effects, and it's been a very rewarding experience so far. Most recently, back in February, we not only won one, but we won two awards for our work in Prehistoric Planet Ice Age. That is the VS and Annie's Awards. And I'd like to just shout out, obviously, the amazing effects team all across the multi-sites that we have across Framestore, as well as all my colleagues here. So there's Guy, Kevin Christensen, Kevin Tarpinian, and Benedict Rutger as well for our great win on the VS and Annie's this year in 2026. And of course, today I am here to talk about the Prehistoric Planet Ice Age. And I'm just going to share a couple of minutes to talk about the show, the background of it, what we did for the show, and the overall kind of idea to produce this. So, in case you don't know, Prehistoric Planet is a documentary. It's a joint venture between BBC Natural History Unit with Apple TV, and it was produced together with John Favreau and Mike Gunton, and obviously the rest of the team, the multi-talented team across BBC and Apple, as well as Framestore. Most recently, on top of our VS and Annie's, we have been nominated for an Emmys this year for Outstanding Special Visual Effects, which is very exciting for us, and we're looking forward for the result of that coming up in the next couple of weeks. But back to the show itself, Prehistoric Planet Ice Age is a documentary. We're on season three at the moment, and it's a special one for us in Framestore because we were able to essentially be a part of the production very, very early on. And this allows us to collaborate in a very interesting way with the production team. Because it's a show, so it spans over five different episodes. That means we had to generate over 5 hours of CG content with a variety of biomes, depending on the episodes. So it's a very wide range of visual effects that we had to do across different conditions, different lighting conditions, different characters, and that's split into multiple different environments that you see here. So we have ice, tundra, we have grasslands, savannas, jungles, all kinds of variety that we have here. For Framestore, it's split across 14 countries in collaboration with Framestore to shoot. That means we were part of the pre-planning very, very early on, and that allows us to also provide additional support to the BBC Natural History Unit to actually go on set and have some of our Framestore team members go out to very, very exciting places. We went to Chile, we went to the outbacks in Australia, we went to Svalbard in Norway. There are a lot of really beautiful places that both the Natural History Unit and the Framestore team were able to go and just shoot some of these very beautiful plates for us. And that's definitely exciting. I was actually going to go to one of those, but it didn't work out in the end. Still very jealous of all the friends that managed to go, which was definitely a great experience. But overall, with Framestore, we had about 1,200 different shots to do. It's spanning across a variety of different complexities. So we included about 220 CG asset builds, so different characters, different animals, and different characters and animals that we have to build from scratch. And this is built in collaboration with the scientific community as well, because at the end of the day, this is a documentary and this is a prehistoric documentary where we are basing a lot of the decisions, a lot of the designs based on the most up-to-date science available. So we had an actual paleontologist, Dr. Darren Naish, which is our scientific consultant, along with a lot of different people that supported this role as well. And that allows us to kind of implement the latest design of the animals based on the latest scientific understanding that we have. So there were some interesting conversations about the way the paw has to be for this particular animal based on the fossil records that we found in this place just last year or anything like that. which is very, very unique for us. It's a mix of, being able to creatively interpret these animals while basing it on the scientific background as well. And with Framestore in this particular season, we were able to offer a full suite service, which means it included previews, shoots, post-vis, and all the CG builds and shot delivery. So this is quite unique, specifically because it allows us to then um, jump in at the very early stage of the work, and we were able to have conversations and pre-planning in a very well in a well manner, which allows us to be very efficient, one, and also to be able to give a creative input of what's possible, what's not possible, or rather, what do we want to achieve as a visual language for this particular show. And at the end of it, we activated three of our sites in Framestore. So that's including London, Montreal, and Mumbai. Specifically for myself, I was working with the London and Mumbai team, and we also have another supervisor in the Montreal side to handle a different sequence split, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. So before we go further, I just want to share the trailer to kind of show you the scope of our work and all the things that we're going to do.
Journey back 1,000,000 years to the Ice Age. From the Big Freeze to the Great Thaw, life finds a way. Experience the Ice Age like never before. Discover a world beyond the ice. Come face to face with creatures that defy imagination. Join us on an epic 5-part event where the surest way to survive is together. Prehistoric Planet Ice Age.
There you go. So before I jump into about effects, I just want to say if you haven't actually had the chance to see the series, it is available now on Apple TV, and you're actually in luck because it's a really good one, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And there'll be something to do for the next couple of days to watch. So jumping in a bit more from just the show overall to the effects itself, there are a couple of different information that I want to share before we jump into the snow part. In effects, we were working across three different sites, so that's the London, Montreal, and the Mumbai team. That translates to about 725 different effect shots and across 50 different effects artists, again, across the three sites. And from there, we sort of split into a different sequence. So London, in the end, had about 16 different sequences working together between London and Mumbai. And Montreal has their own sequences, which is covering about 10 different sequences. Although we're going to talk about the snow more in depth today, I just want to stress that, at the end of this, the snow is actually just a part of a bigger challenge that we have and a bigger suite of work that we had to deliver. So it's not just about the show within the show it's not just about the snow within the show. It's got a lot of different unique effect steps in there. Overall, from start to finish in effects, it's about 18 months for us. But from the start of the pre-production all the way to the delivery, obviously it took way, way longer than that. And yeah, there are a lot of people working hard across a very long time period here. And in terms of scope, for effects specifically, because I've mentioned earlier, it is a documentary first and foremost. So effects' role in this case is a support character. Unlike, the common superhero movies or the more effects heavy shows that we usually work on, we don't really have massive explosions in your face or anything magic related that will be the visual eye candy, so to speak, as different shows. So we knew early on that this is a matter of us supporting the character, us supporting the story, us supporting the science of it to be able to deliver a believable world as if it was shot in real life. So it's a very clear brief very early on that is going to be a naturalistic effects, which means all kinds of interaction from ground pebbles to grass to volumes to snow, all kinds of basically interaction that the animals would be doing to the environment. And it is our job to basically enhance that the best that we can. The main difference with this, though, is that because it is documentary, we were trying very, very consciously to deliver a documentary language. It means we utilize a lot of static camera. We used a lot of long lenses and long frame range because we want to emulate the feeling of as if somebody actually went to these places and the animals are actually there just doing their own thing and we were just there as an observer. So imagine, there will be a natural BBC history unit that would go to this location, sit there for about 2, 3 days in their own bush, and far, far away from the animals with their long lens camera and just capture what's happening within their lives. And then we would bring that footage back and then create the narrative and the story that we want to tell. So that means no, circling drone footage, no close up to the face that with a very complicated camera angle or anything like that. It's all focusing about just being an observer to this world and understanding what they do in their day-to-day lives. So for effects, that means then there's nowhere really to hide. Usually with, a faster action pace sequences, we would have, a nighttime sequence or a very busy sequence where we would be able to hide it, a lot of the effects amongst motion blur, or the cut will be very short. It's about the impact of the shot. While in here, it's all about taking it slow, enjoying the visual, and not being able to hide basically the effects amongst all the other visual distractions that we have. On the Framestore side of view, there are also some scope and challenges that we had to accommodate. So this show back in 2024, that was one of the first shows that we actually tried to implement new USD workflow within our pipeline. So there's a lot of challenges there with different change of how we manage the data, how we manage the input and output between departments, and all the, I guess, complexities that comes with that. And obviously, because this is a cross-site collaboration, there are a lot of assets that we need to kind of interact with between different sites. So one site might be building this character, but the effects might be done in a different site. And there's a lot of data transfers and just communication that we had to manage. Again, on top of the cross-site collaboration, there are also cross-department collaborations. So not only effects doesn't have to work in an isolation. So most of the time we have to communicate a lot with animation, with creature effects, or with lighting and environment, just to be able to manage the data well. And obviously there's the logistical and resource challenge because it is a massive show. It involves a lot of different characters, a lot of different look devs. And like I said earlier, there's a lot of different elements that we have to develop and manage and curate across all these sequences. So, as I mentioned earlier, the snow itself is a considerable part of our development period and our work, but it has to go alongside a lot of different things at the same time. So we had to be able to deliver the best quality that we can while also maintaining everything else in parallel efficiently. So these are an example of all the other things that we have to juggle at the same time. I think I remembered most of the time throughout production, we had about 2 to 4 different sequences active at the same time, which means there are a lot of different effects that we had to develop and review day to day alongside the snow in itself. So I've been talking a lot about the snow, how great it is, but let's have a look at the final visuals and then we can continue from there.
A roll around the snow is the perfect way to give their thick, shaggy coats a clean. But for first-timers, all this snow can be a bit strange. That's the idea. rhinos are fast. Even grandma can run at 20 miles an hour. But the cats are faster still.
All right, so snow. What's so special about it? So specifically for this show, the visual aim for us is quite interesting. So this snow work that we've done here is actually the most detailed with an asterisk snow simulation we've ever done in Framestore. What that means specifically, I'm going to expand on in the next couple of slides. But on top of that, this is a unique opportunity for us to develop a highly detailed close-up sim of fresh powdery snow that would clump, roll, and splash. So I'm going to jump into a couple of different videos here to show you what I mean. So this is one of the examples that we saw earlier. Again, what I mean with being able to develop a highly detailed snow is, the amount of close-up that we see here and the complexity that it has. So specifically, for example, on this shot, we have a snow that would behave very, very light. So we were aiming for a very light, recently kind of coated powdery snow. However, it does need to have its own internal structure. It needs to be able to roll and clump depending on the push that was created by the animals, as well as giving you that sense of very clean and very light and airy. So there is a bit of a complexity there that we need to achieve. And from the technical point of view, it also needs to be repeatable. So as you can see, we showed two different sequences there with a very different pacing. One of them with the sloth, they move very slow. It's very close up. It's very pristine and clean. On the other hand, with the rhino sequence, it was a chase sequence. There's a lot of different animals running around. There are different characters jumping in and out with very splashy behavior of the snow, which we need to be able to repeat consistently to maintain the quality between the two different sequences. So that comes up to about 80 different hero effect shots across two different sequences. We need to be able to make it in a stable and consistent and cost effective manner. And on top of that, we need to take into account the interaction because these animals actually have a very long fur, and we need to be able to interact with these fur to be able to get the snow to stick, to get the fur to push the snow around, and to have a kind of a sort of a feedback loop between the two. So I'm going to expand a bit more on that. For example, on this one, this is what we were kind of shooting on set with the puppetry, which gives us a good reference of the sort of snow behavior that we want. And more on this shot, for example, again, another similar behavior with different coating that we have. So on the top, it feels very light, and then it gets sort of heavier and crunchier. It's able to roll forward and have a different materialism to them, depending on the character. Again, a good example of us kind of shooting references and plates on set. You can see that when obviously the puppet here kick up some of the snow, you get this very light and airy, almost like a particulate and glistening character to the snow, while there are also bits of chunks that got kicked up, and we need to be able to incorporate that essentially. So we were trying to match this from the plate up to the final shot like this. It's always a delightful thing to see how they are kind of moving. I always enjoy these shots. Very pretty. More than that, again, the repeatability of it is very important. So they don't just walk around, right? They have a sliding sequence as well where the snow needs to be pushed and being able to move consistently with that. Again, a wider distance trailing with different kind of kick-ups that we have. Again, with the more faster and more action-based sequences here. So the complexity with this obviously is we need to keep the consistency with the look, with the powdery snow, with the chunks and clumping that we have, as well as managing all the data and the complexity that comes with having this many character kind of jumping in and out. Again, in here we have about a dozen or so different animals. Each of them have very different fur and interaction that we need to take into account. And this one is one of my favorite shots as well with the baby rhino. Um, I just want to start getting into the more technical side of things. So again, if you have any questions, there is a Q&A sections on your Zoom app or on your browser. Please just put it in as we go along, and I can try and answer it at the end. So the technical challenges on the snow, obviously in effects, there are a lot of different common techniques that we can try when we're approaching snow. The most common ones involves npm solver. At this point in time, this was pre-Houdini 20.5, so there wasn't any npm built natively in Houdini. We did try to port the npm solver from Maya to Houdini, and I'll show you some tests later on. Another common approach to do this is to use a grain solver and a vellum solver, obviously. And in terms of data type, there are a couple of different tests you can do. For example, you can pass the snow surface as a volume. So it would be a rasterized points, which will then be converted into volume, which can be very effective. And, a lot of approach has been done online and in research as well to kind of get a very interesting look out of this. You can also do obviously the raw particles. It's a lot heavier and there's a lot of rendering challenges from there, but you will be able to get more control over it. So I'm going to show you some example here. So for example, this is an example of our initial test with rasterizing the points into volume. So you can see there are a lot of issues that we can straight away kind of guess. So coming back to this slide, the common issues with this is that you get a lot of soft edges when you do rasterized volume. So that means on the edges of the character here, you can almost always tell that it's not quite opaque enough. So you can see through the character as one issue and just the behavior and the look of it itself. Generally, you can get away with this if this is a further away character. So if I zoom out here, for example, you don't really see the individual detail of the voxels. So if it's a further character running around, yes, you can probably get away with just doing a rasterized volume. But for us, we know early on with how close the sloth is, that it's not quite a reasonable thing to do. Another common issue here is the settling issue, which I'll show in a minute with our test. But generally speaking, when you do, a simple grain simulation or volume vellum simulation with snow, there's not really a lot of difference between getting a snow behavior and a sand behavior. So a lot of the time you get a nice kick up that looks like snow. The moment they land and settle, you get this sort of almost like a settling feeling that feels like a wet sand, and it just never really sat well for us. So there are some tests here that I can show you. So before I go to that, this is another example of a common approach that we can do. So to save on memory, for example, you don't have to simulate points across the entire depth of the snow, right? You can also do a geometry-based environment that you can shade as snow, but then you would do a deformation-based kind of checks to push the geometry down wherever the pore moves, and then you would simulate a thin layer of particle on top. And when you shade them all together, generally you can get away with this. I think a lot of games do this kind of approach because it's quite cheap. You can do that fairly easily. But again, this doesn't really answer the criteria that we need where the snow needs to clump. It needs to be able to break away and, roll and split into different parts. And doing this approach just is just not enough for us. And we found that out quite early on. So again, this is one of our initial tests, just doing a different solver. So this is the pop grain, this is the vellum grain, and we converted or ported in the Bifrost npm grain solver as well into Houdini for some tests. And you can see that we started looking into clumping. So there are some predefined clumps here just to be able to see, is this the approach that we can go forward with? How does that behave? How do we set the constraints and all that sort of fun stuff? Again, this is one of the more common examples. So you can see there are some sort of constraint that's sort of holding the shapes together, especially around this pore, for example, you can see here. Um, we were just trying to get the balance essentially with the constraints, the shaping, and just getting that different roll and rotation and shaping that we need. Another example for this, common feeling that you can get with that wet sand feeling that I mentioned earlier. So, you can simulate just a section of it in the middle. So you can see almost the line between the geometry here to the particle simulation. But this is another common issue, as you can see. Even though you shade it white, you can still read it as sand, or it has that sandy feeling that doesn't really gives you that really nice, crisp and light snow behavior that we're after. And this is another test of us just kind of getting different chunks and constraints and how do we drive that behavior from there. So from there, we wanted to kind of dive into four different main points on the technical challenges to be able to create what we needed to do. So I'm going to talk more in depth about the how we approach the point counts, how we approach the simulation, rendering, and the feedback loop from there. So in terms of point count, we need a crisp and sharp detail. We know that from the references, we know that from the brief, and we just have to be able to achieve that with a reasonable resolution so that we can populate that and propagate that into different artists to run and to a lot of different shots throughout different sequences as well. Second challenge with that is the shots with backlight, for example, should highlight the fresh ice crystals. So I'm going to show what I mean by that. I'm going to come back a bit here. As you can see in some of the references here, we need almost a very, very sharp and crisp edge on them. So it needs to have this complexity of just the snow and the crystal and the ice sort of blending in this unique state, I guess, of the snow. There is a very specific feeling to that snow. And the moment the particular snow, for example, on the back here is hit the right way with against the sun, you can see a very beautiful glints across. So I'm going to go back here. This one. You can see really interesting behavior between the snow crystals against the sun, which we definitely want to replicate from there. And then again, simulating, we know simulating with the volume doesn't really give us what we need. We know simulating a geometry that we deform down doesn't really give us what we need. Then the last hope would be, as expected, the particles, right? But if we just simulate it at a high point count, it would essentially be very inefficient, right? There would be almost doing it as a brute force method, which, you know, in a modern computing and computer graphics is possible. And in parts that has contributed to how good things can look nowadays because you can just brute force the computations. You can just chuck in more points, you can just put in more volumes and VDB and voxels and get more details that way. Sure, there's one way to do it, but to do that, we need to be aware of the memory that it will take, the sim time, the storage, and the render time as well. So it's just something that we want to explore a bit further before we just jump in and brute force everything essentially. So the goal for this was to achieve as much detail as possible, but only in the areas that we needed. So efficiency plays a big part on how we are approaching this problem. And the solutions that we came up with was particles were simulated with clumping and breakup constraints at a reasonable resolution. So I'm sure a lot of the effects artists around here in this call would be familiar, you know, setting up the constraints based on your solver, whether that's grain or vellum. So that's done in a very reasonable resolution, base resolution, to give us the general and bigger kind of shaping, almost like when you do a sketch, you always draw with the bigger strokes first, and then you kind of come in and refine it further. We kind of took a similar approach to this, where we would focus on the big clumping and breakup constraints that we would like to see within the simulation, and then we will then process that further. So what that means is we worked up a proprietary upres method to inject details to the particle simulation, and then we optimize that further by culling it across the camera frustum. So what I mean by that in here, if I go to this one, so we would simulate, this is a bit of lower res than the final piece that we did, but you can see that we were focusing on the chunks that we have. So we predefined the bits that we like. We were able to simulate that against the loose grain of the snow, and we would get the general shaping of it that we like. So this is another example here. So we were able to get that rolling piece in here, for example, falling down, that would keep its shape. There are a lot of different variations and you know, attributes that were controlled within the simulation. But as you can see in this resolution, it's not particularly heavy, it's not particularly complex to compute in that sense. So it's a fairly quick sim to do. And then from there, we would then run a secondary upres solve. This was developed across multiple different shows, actually. So it's not, it's a continuation of our research internally within Framestore to come up with this tech. Originally came from Artem Smirnov and Benedict Rutger as well, which has done a lot of work on this method, which is very good. And we still continue to use it to this day. So from the upres, from the base sim, we would upres that into the resolution that we need while keeping the general bigger strokes of, the clumping and the behavior that we have here. We would then obviously pass that to shading and a lot more different tricks that I'm going to expand from here. But essentially, that allowed us to keep again, just the outer layer or keep the particle to the minimum amount of particles while keeping the visual impact very efficiently. So again, on the third point here, only a thin outer layer is then kept after the uprest to allow for maximum details with a minimal final point count. So what that means is in this simulation, for example, we would simulate this at a reasonable resolution with the constraints again. And then what we would do is then we would say, if you think about a ray of light coming in to render this, you don't necessarily need to care about whatever's beyond the surface. So say the light will come in and then it would trace along, the particles of the snow coming in up to this depth. Essentially, if you have all this thickness of particle within this area here, you don't gain a lot from keeping them. And obviously, this volume contains a lot more particle than the surface itself because it's a deep volume of subsets of particles here. So what we do is then we ended up culling this and we replaced that either with geometry or just don't have anything inside of it because we know that the light within it wouldn't even go inside, and the trade-off is worth it for us. So from there, again, so if you can look at it here, obviously we have the plate to continue on here, so we never really see the slice anyway in the final shot. And then from there, we were able to then get the final resolution within a reasonable point count. So from there, there's also a trouble with simulation. So with a dozen animals crisscrossing each other over a wide area, for example, in this case, in this example with the sloth, it's fairly contained. The sloth doesn't move as much, so you can kind of maybe get away with more resolution. But what happens if you have, say, 12, 15 different animals running around across a wide range of area, right? So if you think about the sloth earlier, it's probably just covering, say, this section here. But now we have to cover a wide range of motion here, as well as the distance and the depth to the camera as well. Again, like I mentioned, we usually work with a very long lens. So even though this rhino here and this rhino here looks close by from the camera, it's because of the long lens. This is actually covering quite a deep section of the snow simulation, which if we brute force, is going to cost a lot of time, a lot of memory, a lot of storage, as we mentioned earlier. So again, that's one problem. And simulating everything in one go would be inefficient and very difficult to iterate. What I mean by that, for example, is if you look at this image here, if you simulate all the snow as one single simulation, one, it would be very heavy. Secondly, it would be inefficient in the sense that whatever the rhino is doing here would never affect what the snow is doing over there, right? So we decided that we can easily just split out the simulation into multiple different sections, and that allows us to then run them in parallel or update them accordingly, depending on which rhino has the animation update. Because if we simulate all of this in one go, for example, and then we got notes from the client that says, I don't like this rhino on the left, I want to move it 5 meters to the right, for example. If you simulate everything in one go, you would end up having to simulate everything again the moment we have any tiny updates. If we separate them, we would then be able to just say, okay, we like the section on the right, that's not going to change. Let's just resimulate the stuff on the left, and that allows us to be more efficient that way. So again, the solution for that is a custom clustering solve based on animation path and interaction over time. So I'll show you what that means over here. So let's take an example of this particular shot here. I will kill this. So we have 12 different animals, 15 different animals running around. And if you take it apart, basically this is an example of one of the cluster, just one of the rhino in the foreground. And what we would do is we have our own tool to separate the paths of the animals, so independent of the camera. And we say, okay, depending on the path that the animal's running at, so this blue line here is where the camera is looking at. So if I draw, so we were originally looking at the camera here. So that's the camera. Again, that's the camera frustum, and that's what we saw in this shot here. So from there, we were able to then isolate and say, okay, the stuff on the red, the path on the red will interact with each other. So we want to simulate them in one go. The green one will be another different path. We'll simulate that separately, and the pink one will be a separate thing. As you can see, there are some overlap here, for example, that you might say, hey, hang on a second, this is an intersection that we need to, simulate together, essentially, right? But actually, based on the angle of this, you don't necessarily see or read it. So we were able to get away without it, for example. And again, similar with this section here. But overall, this allows us to then isolate things quite quickly. And that means we were able then to simulate that separately as a different cluster. So that would be cluster one, cluster two, cluster three, like so. And what that looks like is something like this. So we would have different simulations that we can control. We can address nodes that way. And then this again would be called according to the camera. So we don't have to keep the points that are outside of the camera. That gives us more, I guess, playroom to be able to add more detail to the area that we definitely see. And everything else outside of it will be culled. And then again, when you push that out into a different shot like this, again, this is then pre-processed depending on the path of the character, simulated differently into a different cluster like so, based on the camera. And then again, it would be separated and passed that way. The other issue here is that on top of that, sometimes even with the optimization, we still need to be able to control it even more and optimize it even more. So apart from the clustering solve that we see here, so these are different clusters, we would also then split them up again into different seeds. For example, if you see the sequence, the animals run from this section here to this section here. Whatever happens in this area doesn't necessarily mean we need to care about when the animals are here. So essentially, you can think of it as another clustering that we can do, which we basically call it seeding. So we would basically chop this area again. So this is a one cluster of the green. We would chop them into different sections again, where that would then be simmed independently. And what that looks like is something like this. So you can think of it as this is cluster one, this is cluster two, and then within cluster one, we would then seed them again into different simulations. Essentially, each of these color is an independent simulation that doesn't really care about what's happening on the other sections of the simulation. So what that means is these guys can just slide, and then the moment this area is finished, we can just turn off that simulation and then turn on the second part, turn on the third part, and so on to be able to then get the optimized simulation that way. There is a bit of an overlap between clusters and between seeds to allow for that blending here. So this is what I mean by there is a 15% cluster overlap, allowing for a seamless integration and interaction between the seed. What that means then is that all of these optimizations allowed us to actually have a quick turnaround. So overall, if we get a new animation, the base simulation is generally less than 2 hours, which is quite considerable saving considering the complexity of things that we're doing. And what that also means is that if we have animation in the morning, generally by around lunchtime, it would be able to get a version to be reviewed and discussed with the supervisors, which is very, very powerful for us. And this allows us for faster post-processing and as well as possibility for a distance-based resolution. For example, if the rhino here is very close up, we can simulate that with a higher resolution. If the character's on the back, we can simulate that at a lower resolution. We didn't end up doing this because we didn't have the need in the end, but it allows for that implementation if needed. So in terms of rendering, we also have a couple of things here. For example, the complexity of the asset itself is very, very heavy. So for example, in this case, the mammoths, the baby mammoths, the groom, the mixture between the groom, the environment, the trees, and the mountains behind is already considerable in terms of the amount of resource it takes to render. So before we even add any of our point count from the snow, it already is quite heavy to render and quite expensive to render. So we need to be able to pass the data that we have efficiently for the best bang for the buck, basically. Um, Again, heavy effects adds considerably to the render load. And then we need to, at the same time, we need to pass enough details to be able to then be solved in the renderings stage. Again, we need to also think about the light trace sample here because with lighting, especially these ice crystals, they're essentially ice, which is frozen water. So there's the reflection refraction that we need to think about, and that can get very heavy very quickly. So the common issues with this is if we don't render with enough light sample, you can get quite a dark and sandy look to the snow. And to be able to get this really beautiful white, bright look, we definitely needed to do a bit of work around. So the solution that we came up for that is a subset of the particles will then split an instance with hexagonal crystal geometry. So what that means is out of the main particle simulation here, we take a small number of particles and then we would instance an actual crystal geometry. So for example, if you have, say, that amount of particle here, you would take a couple of points and then we would convert that point into a more of a crystalline shape here to be able to get that glinty look that we see. We then also increase the path depth by a factor of 5 to ensure the accurate snow and light tracing. And then this is quite interesting. The particle will then render as a rotated disk rather than spheres. So I'm going to show you an example for that now here. So this is an example of a single frame. Obviously, it's not comped and it's just a raw render. So there are a lot of artifacts that we see here, and there's not a lot of motion blur computed correctly here, but it shows the idea that we were trying to achieve. So in this case, we have an uprest particle, but because we were rendering it as spheres, you can see that it looks very blobby. So there's a lot of these kind of spherical look that kind of breaks the illusion. And there's a lot of different dark patches here as well that affected or prohibited us to get that very clean, snowy look. However, if we convert this from spheres into disks, we were able to get a cleaner, a cheaper and cleaner sampling, as well as getting a bit of a breakup across the edge here. So again, I'm going to break this back and forth. So switching it from spheres into a rotated disk allowed us to kind of not only save on our rendering, but also get a cleaner look for much cheaper with extra complexity to it as well. Again, once you see it moving and comp properly, it definitely adds quite a lot to the lightness that we were after on this. So in terms of feedback loop, again, this is a standard department flow in Framestore or in a lot of visual effects houses. Usually you would have animation and then creature effects and then effects and lighting. So the complex bit on this is that animation needs to know where the effects snow will settle, right? So if animation has the sloth coming in across that mound of snow there, they need to know where the snow is going to fall and where the leg can step for the next time. However, effects would need the animation first to then trigger the snow so that the snow can roll around. How do you then communicate this kind of chicken and egg problem, right? Within these two departments. Same with creature effects. You have fur that needs to be affected by the snow. So the fur will need to hit the snow at the right time. For example, there's snow falling or snow rolling around, and the fur hits it. For the fur to know where the snow is, we need to get the fur to then simulate an effects to begin with. So there's a lot of loop that we need to figure out from there. So the solution for that, in terms of the anim, is we have two different ground level. So we have a ground level and a snow level to define how thick the snow is. What that means is, for example, in this case, if I go back to this one, maybe this one here, we would have two different ground. So if we say have the animal as a block for now, and then we would have a ground level, which is the absolute ground truth without the snow. So animation knows to not animate the leg below this point. But we would also have a separate ground where we would say, okay, in this shot, we know that it's going to be roughly this deep of snow. So once we have those references, then animation can say, okay, in this frame, I know there will be roughly some snow in this area. I can try and exaggerate the kick up to be able to give effects interesting behavior in the simulation, for example. Once we have that, we would then simulate the primary sim in effects, and then we would pass that back to animation using our proprietary visualization of the snow. So animation, once they run the second loop, will be able to see a rough, simple geometry representation of the initial sim. That will then get passed to us in effects for extra performance and additional finaling, which then gives us the final look. Same with creature effects here. We have a curve representation of the fur that will then be given to us in effects. We would then use that as a collider to give us an initial sections of intersections or initial interaction that we need in our first pass of the snow, and then we would pass that back to CFX, and then they would simulate again, and we would simulate again. It's not on every shot that we need to do that, but generally for the closer up ones, we do have to approach it that way. And then additionally, there's also an asset level instance scatter where we added fur clumping to the frozen ice bits. So I'll show you some visuals on that. Come back to here. So this is an example of the fur representation here. So we have creature fur represented in our Houdini scenes, and we would simulate with that, give us a bit of clumping, and then creature effects will be able to take that back and then influence their fur for the final pass if necessary. Again, this one is the acetization that I mentioned. So there are sections of the snow that sections of the fur that we know will need these snow clumps permanently on the body. So rather than simulating that every single time, we ended up acetizing that to be able to have the look settled. So I'll show you a more interesting example here of the baby. So all of these clumps and things sticking to the fur is predefined at an asset level. It will be moved together with animation, creature effects for free, essentially. And then if there are any additional sims that we need to do, we will then run that on top of our final sim. So again, this section here generally is a live effect simulation, and then the area around the fur, most of them would stay as an asset level deformation, and then we'll add additional passes of things falling down as necessary. Again, that allows us to then define, the look depending on the sequence. So in this case, we have a high variation, a medium variation, and a low variation, depending on where the mammoths are in the blizzard, for example. And this is how it looks at an asset level, predefined. We'll follow the movement. And then once we sim that against the ground impact, we get the full package. So yeah, from there, we basically, if I go here, from there, we were able to then, yeah, kind of pack it all together. And this is an example of the audition that the mummy mammoth did, and it worked out quite well. So to summarize all of that, we were able to achieve the most detailed snow simulation we've ever done, not by throwing in just the maximum amount of particle. We're not saying this is a billion point simulation that we did and it's super heavy and it's the most number of points that we can cram. This is a most detailed snow simulation we've ever done by solving creatively based on our knowledge base through point count simulation, rendering, and feedback loop. So from there, obviously, it's a lot of information. I'm just going to play one more video here on just what we've discussed earlier as a summary here.
The first episode of Prehistoric Planet Ice Age presented numerous challenges due to the intricate snow interactions throughout. For the mammoths, our goal was to create a highly detailed snow scatter on top of dynamic fur, so we could drive the CFX and fur simulations bidirectionally based on the snow coverage. 4 main layers of snow and ice were embedded in the fur using a combination of point instancing and geometry. At a shot level, filtering, culling, curve-based vex deformation, and QC rendering was automated, meaning more artist time could be spent creatively. For the fur simulations, we restricted the movement of certain strands of hair based on the amount of snow attached. We used an attribute to drive the entanglement, tagging some strands of hair to define where motion should be limited. We also wanted to show narratively how each individual in the herd was shielding the others from the blizzard. Wind shadowing was set up so that depending on their position, the mammoths were covering each other. Throughout the episode, long interactions with deep snow required simulations for close-up shots, accommodating powdery and icy snow that would clump, roll, splash, and fracture when colliding with itself and creatures' fur. Particles were simulated with clumping and breakup constraints as normal. Then, a proprietary up-res tool was used to inject details. Sims were then optimized to the camera frustum, so only a thin outer layer was kept after up-res to allow for maximum details with minimal final point count. Exports had to be highly efficient, as cramming a very high number of points in the snow meant adding a considerable load at the render stage. A subset of the surface particles was selected and instanced with hexagonal crystal geometry to enhance the sparkling glints created by sunlight. Each particle was rendered as randomly rotated disks to allow for irregular light and shadowing for extra contrast details. We also needed to find a way to pass information back into upstream departments. Animation needed to know how the snow would accumulate and compress. Creature effects needed to get the snow data to collide with the fur, while FX also needed the final groom to simulate the final pass.
Thank you very much and have a good day.